Okay, I'm going to be talking about this poem called Forever Parted. This is a poem that I found when I was in high school, I believe, in this book, vintage book of contemporary poetry, contemporary world poetry. And interestingly enough, I can't even find the text online anywhere. See, there are things that don't exist on the internet. So I had to make those crappy copies with my phone. So I apologize for that. But in uh, in an attempt to make it up for you, I'll just read the entire poem in the course of this little lecture right now. Hopefully that won't be too brutally painful. So there's background to this poem that I never knew when I was young and I fell in love with the poem. Uh, Poem is written by Cheng, a very famous Chinese poet. He wrote this poem when he was about 24. About 25 years later, he, having already been famous in China, achieved a degree of notoriety when he killed his wife and then hanged himself. So this is something that I didn't realize when I first read this poem, but if you look at his biography, it's those are the details that he ended his life as a murderer, and that's just something I wanted to leave there at the beginning as a sort of context for this poem, which isn't necessarily helpful, but it's true, and I think it's important that in life we try and struggle with whatever the truth is. And so this is a sort of texture of this poem. We have a very sensitive, very powerful poem, and then we find out that the poet lived a very disturbed life. It's just interesting to think about and to look at. I think that it's pretty clear from what if you read more of his biography, it's pretty clear that he was a very disturbed person. He was very psychologically disturbed, perhaps probably especially later in life. And psychological illness will do that to you. Mental illness will do that to you. I have two little quotations here that I always try to remind myself. We can talk about these as humanist quotations. I always try and remind myself stuff like this when I encounter stories of people who I admire for something of what they've done, but there's also something very disturbing that they've done, such as in this case of Gu Cheng. So Terence, this is a famous quotation by a Roman playwright named Terence. He says, "I am human. I consider nothing human alien to me. Nothing human is foreign to me." So that's Terence. Then there's a song where I played a Sir John Stevens song earlier in the class. This is another song that he wrote called John Wayne Gacy Jr. It's about a serial killer in the 1970s, and it's kind of a ballad where he goes through and says all the awful things that John Wayne Gacy did and the way he tricked people into thinking that he was a good person. And then the last line of the song is, "In my best behavior, I am really just like him. Look beneath the floorboards for the secrets I have hid." Very haunting line. But one of the things that a line like that sort of points at is human beings are capable of really awful things, and we are human beings, and so sort of you have one option when you hear about awful things that people did. You have the option to say, well, I'm the good type and that's the bad type, and I have nothing to do with people like that. And the other option is to say, what is it? To ask the question, what is it that's in a human being? What's in it is it that's in human DNA, right? We share like 99% of our DNA with every other human that's ever lived. What is it in that DNA that could go wrong in that fashion so as to do this? And so with Gu Cheng, what could go wrong to make someone kill his wife and hang himself? Um, and I think that that's something about the delicacy of the human mind. And uh, I think it's healthy to realize that the human mind is capable of awful things. I think that's one of the things that keeps us from being the person that ends up particularly touched by these sorts of awful decisions. But maybe nothing but luck can keep us entirely away from them. So let's move into the poem. So I gave you a background video to watch about these individuals. This is just one group of them. These are the Red Guards. So I hope that you've watched that background video by now. If not, stop watching me right now and go back and watch that video for background. These were the Red Guards. They were sort of youth organization, um, a sort of college age, uh, you know, group of young people that got together. And I'm just noticing in this picture that several of them appear to be ready for the coronavirus. I didn't realize that was a problem at the time. But anyway, with their masks there, they were a youth organization. In some ways, like you might think about, I don't know, like the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts, except a little older. You might think about something like Greenpeace. Often, a lot of young people do that. AmeriCorps, or some people, some of you may have sort of familiarity with in Germany in the 1930s, what were called the Hitler Youth. So this was an enthusiastic youth organization, and it was encouraged by Mao Zedong's uh, communist government in China, where at this point in the mid '60s, Mao had been in charge for a good deal of time, but he had not eradicated the history of China. He had not changed its history and its traditions to the degree that he and especially some people more than him thought that it needed to happen with a communist insurrection. And so these Red Guards were on the front lines of purifying China of all of that, and purifying China of capitalism, of greed, of its possessions, of its history, especially its capitalist history. But there was a lot of blurring, and this was called the Cultural Revolution. And there were battles in this. There were people killed. There were so imagine like they find a rich banker, or a person who had been a rich banker, who had sympathies with the banking system or financial system, and uh, or with sort of Western ideas, and they take them and they torture them. They might kill them. This is one of the things that the Red Guards did. They would destroy monuments to the way things used to be. They would destroy buildings. But there was a fiery zeal and vision behind what they were doing. They were idealists. They wanted a world in which the worker had a equal role, had an equal power, and a world in which the sort of moneyed class, the historically powerful class, was not influential. So this is actually a pretty good lesson if we think about groups like Antifa, if you're familiar with Antifa, which is a group that sort of hates, um, the traditional American financial system and everything that it stands for, and hates sort of patriarchal culture and everything that it stands for. And I think that there's something in the ideals there that can be very admirable, but there's something in the practice of it that could be very dangerous or problematic, right? If we destroy our history or the history of some of us, what does that really accomplish? The history is no longer there as a reminder, both for good and for evil. So the Red Guards killed many people. They also captured popular sentiment. They encountered resistance. There was resistance within the Red Guards. There were different levels of extremism within the guards, and there were battles that broke out between one group of Red Guards and another, and there was resistance outside in many of the powerful regions of China, and uh, there were these battles in this city, Chongqing, over a period of months, maybe years, I'm not sure, and there were thousands killed, and they started digging the graves. These were not just Red Guards who were killed, but some of them were Red Guards. Many of them were Red Guards, and there was a graveyard that eventually got built and was given a special title by Mao. He called it the graveyard of the Revolutionary Martyrs. He called these Red Guards the Revolutionary Martyrs. But over time, as China's extremism and zeal for communism changed somewhat, relaxed, this period of the Cultural Revolution was thought of as a sort of black eye on China. And the Red Guards were disowned. They were not thought of as revolutionary martyrs. They were thought of as a group of people that we wish we never had any association with. And so at the time of Cheng writing the poem, which I believe was around 1980, he comes across these graves and the grass is overgrown nearby. There was actually a series of years, around 40 years, when no one was allowed to visit this graveyard. It was fenced off because I believe it's more like 30 years actually, but it was fenced off because this was a period that the government didn't want people to remember. So the poem here is a reflection on the ambiguity of dying for a cause that many people no longer believe in. This is an image of this graveyard, these monuments that were built for these Red Guards. The poem is also a personal reflection from Cheng about his admiration for an older friend of his. So the young man that was his friend was probably around 18 or 19 in the Red Guards when he died, which was quite possibly in 1968, where much of the fighting happened in Chongqing. Would have been, the poet, would have been around 12 years old at that time. So this is, the poet was written in 1980, So that means there were 12 years that passed in between when his friend died and when Cheng visited this graveyard. And we can see from the poem that it's the first time that he visited this graveyard. So I'm going to read from the poem. Forever parted graveyard. A labyrinth of byways brought me here among you. A labyrinth of byways brought me here among you, like a solitary shaft of sunlight where the tall grass and the short trees rise up together. I do not represent history or the sounds that issue from high places. I came because it was time for me to come. You fell in a heap here on this ground together, tears of joy in your eyes, grasping imaginary guns. Your hands were soft, your nails clean, the hands of those who'd opened school books and storybooks, books about heroes. And maybe just out of habit, a habit we share, on the last page you wrote your name, your life, your own story. It's a very powerful sort of dramatic irony to this portion of the poem because this young man that the poem is written about would have died thinking that he was on the cusp of a great revolution, that he was doing something great that would stand for decades or centuries, that everyone would love what these young people did. And if they died as heroes, they died as martyrs. But the dramatic irony is that the reader of this poem knows that they are not respected, that they are not thought of as heroes, that their sacrifice means nothing to people. It's an embarrassment. So this is a very powerful juxtaposition. I think if you've ever seen the musical Les Miserables, there's a song in it called "Empty Chairs at Empty Tables," and you might be able to hear the resonance of that, the revolution that goes nowhere. Now on my heart's page there is no grid to guide my hand, no character to trace, only the moisture, the ink blue dew that has dripped from the leaves. To spread it I can't use a pen, I can't use a writing brush, can only use my life's gentlest breath to make a single line of marks worth puzzling over. The clouds at Gayushan are cold. The clouds at Gayushan are cold, like a bloodless hand pointing toward the graves, in fire and in molten lead, sunken, silent, mother and father so caress the beloved child. You didn't forget the words they bequeathed you. Maybe it was just those voices that called on you to die. You breathe the same faith with your very last breath. You don't really lie so far apart. But on the one side there are still fresh flowers, lively Sunday visitors and the young pioneers, and in the other, birds and beggars' lice, ants and lizards. The story here is of the parents of this young man who died. And it seems like he is following in their vision, their vision of equality, their vision of the worker's dignity. And he says, maybe it was just those voices that called on you to die. You're all so young, heads of raven hair, death's dark night will keep you so pure forever. I can wish, I can hope for the young pioneer, for the new fruit. Or I can wish I were you, a wedding picture, fortunate instant that lingers forever, but I go on living, mind drawn out, like a little boat, bearing slowly through the dusk toward the shore. So this business here of the young pioneers were the sort of the Cub Scouts, the earlier transition that you went on before you became one of the Red Guards. It's the younger group. this vision of energy of sort of indoctrination, like these young people being indoctrinated, but also just full of vibrancy and life and excitement. And earlier here we have the contrast between the living and the dead. You don't lie so far apart, but on the one side there are fresh flowers, and on the other, birds and beggar's lice, ants and lizards. Again, an emphasis on how this portion of the graveyard is completely ignored, and is an embarrassment. He says, I don't have a brother. I don't have an older brother, but I believe you are my older brother. In the sand pile and the cicada's shrill, you made a clay tank and gave it to me. You made me a paper plane, too. You taught me to write characters, to string them artfully together. You were a giant already in 6th grade. I have an older sister, but I believe you are also my older sister. In the dazzle of the morning light, skipping rope, jumping so high, turning from side to side as a part of the game, as if the brightly colored strands could catapult you straight up to the sky, but they were stretched too tight, and I ended up tangled from standing too close. And him, who is he? Who pulled the golden feathers from the reed finch's wings, splattering the whole earth with tiny drops of blood, or teased the borer beetle with bounds and flame, and forced him to totter across a window sill stage, and forced him to totter across a window sill stage for the crime of eating wood chips? Who was that? I don't know him. A man only. This is mysterious, as lots of things in poetry are mysterious. I think it likely that we're once again talking about one of the parents of this young man. I think we're talking about the father, and I think we see a violence. Whoever this is, we see a violence to him, torturing animals. You lived among the peaks. You lived behind walls. Every day you went where you should go, away from the sea you'd never seen. You never knew love, never dreamed of another continent, another world, only saw evils afloat in the fog. Down the middle of every desk, in chalk, ran the battle line of the chess game. You walked it, you smiled, and hid whatever you might be moved to think, if you thought it not right. Moonlight hidden in the shade of branches, your law was unfeeling, pitiless. And you took that cold sparkle for your festival, your fireworks, and then, one fine morning, with a handful of dry leaves, you polished bright the bronze buttons on your leather coat and departed. We see what led this young man to be a Red Guard, to fight this cultural war. And it's this duty, this everyday doing what he should do, seeing these evils afloat in the fog, seeing things the way that we've been shown to see them. And the poet wants to say, maybe there's an indoctrination, a way that seeing things that we've been shown that limits our world, that limits our possibilities, and limits our perceptions of the truth. Everybody knew it was the sun who led you to the tune of a marching song off to paradise. Later, halfway there, you tripped over a bed whose frame was inlaid with stars and bullet holes. It had seemed to you a game to play, a game where you could always start over. Do not question the sun. Yesterday was not his fault. Yesterday, there was another star, a star that burned away in the fearsome fire of hope. Today's shrine holds carefully selected potted plants and perfect silence, the silence of an iceberg afloat on a warm current. When will the raucous bazaar, when will the patched-up merry-go-round come to life, start to move again, carrying the dancers, or the silent young, the toothless infants, and the toothless old? Maybe there are always a few lives destined to be shed by the world. The white crane's feathers found every day at the campsite. Maybe there are always a few lives destined to be shed by the world. We see here the shedding of life, the dying, but also the way that this person's death, that these Red Guards' death, was just shrugged off by people. Tangerine and pale green, sweet and bitter, the lights come on. In the fog-soaked dusk, time heals, and we go on living. Let's go home and go back to living. I haven't forgotten. I'll walk carefully past the graves. The empty eggshell of the moon will wait there for the birds that have left to return. Yes, I go also. Yes, I am going as well to another world, another generation stepping over your hands. Though there are fallen leaves and a scanty snow on the winter sky, I will go on as before. Beside me, the stones, and the dark grove, and little town as pretty as a cupcake. I am going to love and to seek out my soulmates because it is time for me to go and to seek. This image of stepping over your hands, another generation stepping over your hands. I believe that you are the fortunate ones because the wide earth cannot flow off with that arrogant, that innocent grin, nor will it float up from the red clay and be gone. November's misting rain, when it trickles down to you, will filter out life's doubts. Eternal dreams are purer, simpler than life. I believe that you are the fortunate ones, the poet says, and that the dead are the fortunate ones. But particularly this type of dead person, right? We're talking about someone who died as a visionary, who died fully believing in what he was doing. And in a certain way, Cheng doesn't agree with the approach. Cheng doesn't agree with the destruction of these monuments. He doesn't agree with the killing of the capitalists. He doesn't agree with any of that. But he sees his friend died as a visionary in this innocence, this naivete, this belief. And he admires it, and he wishes for that simple of a world, that simple of a life, that clean of a death. We have the image of November's misting rain. When it trickles down to you, will filter out life's doubts. Eternal dreams are purer, simpler than life. We're stuck, the ones of us that are living, the ones of us that think about things, the ones of us that question, we're stuck in this world of life's doubts, this messiness. We're stuck back where where we have the rotten things, the burrs and the beggar's lice, the ants and the lizards. We're stuck there. The only contact that we have with this sort of purity is in the cemetery, and the cemetery does not hold that sort of innocence for us, perhaps. But we go back to this imagery of the cemetery here. I left the cemetery, left behind the night, and the tangled vines of darkness, still groping, stroking the words engraved on your stones. Groping for you, groping for that life of yours. Farther off, the burying ground. I wish you peace. I wish the labyrinth of byways may be lost. I wish the labyrinth of byways may one day be lost beneath the new young green of spring. The labyrinth of byways being the paths that brought Gu Cheng to this place, the paths that brought him to his friend's grave. And he wants those to be lost, and he wants them to be lost beneath the new young green of spring, the new young green, the new life. Surely this image of his friend's innocence, of his friend's visionary approach, of this idealism. Uh, you can hope that Gu Cheng found that idealism, but the biography of his life seems to say that he didn't. Um, you know, a thought here is, what is it that comes of going to a cemetery? What is it that comes of visiting um, the gravestone, the grave of someone that you lost? I think that it's complicated. I think that it's um, hard to describe. It's hard to say, this is what you should feel. This is what happens there. This is the way. This is what you're supposed to come to. This is the uh, insight of visiting a cemetery. Sometimes there could be no insight whatsoever. At the beginning of teaching this class, actually in late January or early February, I was dropping my son off at a practice for baseball, and I had about an hour and a half, and I decided not to go home. I decided my car almost drove itself to the cemetery that was about 3 blocks away from where I dropped my son off. This is the cemetery where my grandparents are buried. And I went to their grave, and it was snowy. And I thought, will I be able to find it? But I had forgotten that their gravestones were set up, were these vertical, small vertical stones. And so in the midst of a field of graves that you couldn't see anything, there were my grandfather and my grandmother's names, and their gravestones right there. And I stayed there for a while. And then I reflected on it. I don't know what reflections you think there, but there was a whole number of things that I was thinking of. And then I went to the section where there's a little gravestone of the child that my wife and I miscarried. My wife miscarried, and we had a little grave that we had for her. And as I said, it was a snowy day, and I had no idea where it was. And I went there, and I took the little scraper, because I didn't have a shovel. I took the little scraper from my car, and so I'm there in the snow, and I'm sort of like with my scraper trying to find a gravestone, and trying to find her gravestone, and it took me a long time to even uncover one gravestone, and it wasn't hers. I didn't know where to go, but I'm it's a sort of interesting symbolism of not even being able to find your loss, not even being able to find the monument to what you have lost. But in a certain way, that's similar to the story of Gu Cheng here, where the graveyard, nature wins, nature overcomes it. It could be snow today, but it could be weeds, it could be overgrowth, it could be trees, it could be an earthquake. Nature always wins, and no human monument will stand for long. No human monument will give us that connection forever. But when we go to a graveyard, when we go to a cemetery, that is a place where we reflect on the fact that someone else's story connected with ours. Someone else's story intersects with ours and meant something to our stories. And I think we can live more meaningful lives when we realize that our story is not just on its own. but it intersects with these people's lives, these people that have gone before us, in mysterious ways, sometimes in disturbing ways, in strange ways. We might be irritated with them. We might admire them. We might not know why we care. Why do I give a damn about this person who maybe didn't give a damn about me? Or who hurt people that I love, or who hurt me. But our lives do intersect with these stories, and I'm confident that there's something to be gained from remembering that, and not letting the weeds overcome what is much more important than a gravestone, which is our memories and our connections with people in our lives. That sounds really cheesy, but that's what I have to say today. See ya.